Okay, just gonna let people filter in here. All right. Hello, everyone. We're just gonna give it a second, let people join, and then we'll get started in just a second. There's a siren going by, so I'm gonna mute myself real quick. It does not help that I live near both a hospital and a fire station, so with Zoom meetings, but all right, that seems like a good amount of people. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our mock lecture on nuclear weapons and international conflict with Professor Kaplow of the Government Department, which is very exciting. This is a great lecture. It's gonna be a lot of fun. I mean, as much fun as nuclear weapons can be, I suppose. Just a little bit of intel about how today is gonna go. We're going to go through the lecture. We are going to encourage participation as much as we can. I'm sure a bunch of you are rising scholars in the government IR and public policy departments, and we'd love to hear from you. When we get to the point where you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I'll turn it over to Professor Kaplow and let him get started. But cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone, for being here, taking the time to spend a little time with me on this mock lecture. I'm usually excited to be doing these in person, and obviously this is a weird year, but I appreciate you going through this whole online lecture thing just to get a chance to see what it would be like if you were here in person. So I'm coming to you today from not my real office. This is an aspirational office. I was thinking as long as we're Zooming in anyway, I should have an office that I really want rather than the one I actually have, which is nice, right? But it's not this nice. So thank you for joining me here. I am unwilling to relinquish control of the spotlight. So let me try to share a screen here. That hopefully worked, and you can still see me. What I'm going to do is use a few slides. I'm going to put them over my shoulder here, trying to relive the I don't know, Saturday Night Live weekend update kind of thing, which I never got to do. So let me just move myself down in the corner. So this mock lecture is on nuclear weapons and international conflict. And again, I'm Jeff Kaplow. I am an assistant professor in the government department here at William & Mary. And I came to William & Mary after a number of years working for the US government in the US intelligence community and in some policy roles. I worked at the State Department, at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, all working mostly on nuclear weapons issues. And so I've kind of continued that interest into my work here at William & Mary. And then I kind of, I abandoned what seemed like a successful career to come here and talk to you guys. So I'm glad you're here with me today. Let me just tell you a little bit about me and what I do here. So I teach classes. So right now I'm teaching a class called Government 100, Predicting the Future. That's a freshman seminar. And it's looks at a bunch of different ways of predicting and forecasting. We just finished predicting the March Madness tournament. We have some Oscar predictions going on right now, and it teaches students a bunch of different techniques for how to predict things and how to think kind of in a systematic, structured way about uncertainty, including about the future. I also teach international security pretty frequently. It's a class about international conflict in the world. And I teach a class called The Politics of Nuclear Weapons that features a bunch of guest speakers who work on nuclear weapons issues in government and nonprofits and think tanks to talk to students about the real issues that they have to deal with in their careers. So one thing I do is teach classes. Another thing I do is research. And my research interests revolve around nuclear proliferation. That is what makes some states get nuclear weapons. What are the consequences of states getting nuclear weapons? That's nuclear deterrence. Can nuclear weapons help prevent conflict? We'll talk about that in a moment. I work on international and civil conflict. So I have some work on why do parties to civil war refuse to negotiate under certain situations. And I'm finishing up a book on international security institutions. These are like international organizations that try to prevent the war from breaking out, or in the case that I'm working on, try to prevent countries from getting nuclear weapons and how those work. So I teach, I do research, and then I do kind of a combination of the two because I direct an undergraduate research laboratory called NucLab. And this is a place where students come and we can kind of apply social science theory and methods to important issues in nuclear security, including nuclear proliferation. And we're based at William & Mary's Global Research Institute, which has a lot of great undergraduate research opportunities that I hope you'll look into if you're looking into coming here. Okay, so that's me. So I'm interested also in hearing about you. We can't really go around the room, but we do have a chat. So I wonder if you would go into chat. This is maybe a little tricky, but we can try it. And just tell me, where you're from. Do you have an idea about a major? Why are you deciding to spend a little time here with me now instead of all the other things you can be doing? Does something interest you about nuclear weapons? Let's give it a try. So go into the chat and try to, do we have a chat open here, Peter? We do. Okay. And go to the chat and try to
Yes, we do.
and tell me where you're from at least, or I'm be forced to assume you're from Northern Virginia, and not all of you want that.
All right, 2 out-of-state students already. That's great.
Excellent.
This Chicago.
Jill's from Houston. My sister lives in Houston. Great city. That's the kind of hard-hitting analysis you're going to get from this mock lecture there.
Arkansas. That's exciting.
Excellent. So we have a couple of prospective government majors here. Got some Nova people. That's good. I'd start to wonder what was going on if there were no Northern Virginia folk. Well, we have a joint degree program student. Excellent. William & Mary's joint degree program with St. Andrews University in Scotland. That's wonderful. Hello, Mary from Massachusetts. Thank you for joining.
Vancouver, Washington, not Canada. Glad you're here regardless.
Chattanooga, there's a good city too. So we have some prospective IR majors. That's great. I'm happy to answer questions at the end of the talk about international relations, majoring in international relations at William & Mary. It's a great multidisciplinary program here with some excellent faculty. So I'm happy to talk more about that. And I should have said, like, no pressure to know a major now. That's a little bit early, coming in already knowing exactly what you want to do. So I hope everyone will keep an open mind. And if you have to change to Italian literature, I think that's a good move too. Okay, great. Just flipping through here. New Jersey, Fairfax, Virginia. Excellent. Oh, well, thank you everybody for contributing to the conversation here. It makes me feel less alone here with, just Peter on my screen. All right. So that's about me. That's you. Thank you for joining me. What are we doing here? So I've been asking myself this question a lot. This is maybe you don't want to know about the existential dread portion of the talk, but I mean, like, what are we doing here in this talk? If you are anything like my students who I'm currently teaching through various virtual learning means, you may be folding your laundry, you maybe have the baseball game on in another window, right? So I know that I might not be able to grab your attention the way I would if you were here in person. So I thought what I would do is just tell you right off the bat what we're going to talk about today, so that if your mind wanders or you decide to bail, you'll have gotten the full thing that you were going to get. Okay, so I'm going to do 5 things in this talk. And this is also a commitment mechanism for me, because if I fail to do these 5 things, well, then you'll know that I was not successful in delivering the mock lecture that I had planned. The first thing I'm going to do is ask a big question, okay? And I try to do that in actual class lectures too. Each class lecture should have a really big question, something we can really get into, sink our teeth into, because, life's too short for little questions. We'll ask the big questions. The next thing I'm going to do is tell an overly long story about moving into a new house and not being able to find a particular light switch, which is every bit as fascinating as it sounds on this slide. We'll do that. I'm going to make an important point, I hope, about the design of social science research, about a research design point related to nuclear weapons. So that'll be something to stick around for. And then mostly I'm going to generally fail to answer the question that I introduced in step one. Just wanted to alert you to that in advance, so expectations are set. And then finally, I'm going to say something about the nature of scientific inquiry that will hopefully end this lecture on an inspirational high rather than a depressing low. Okay, that's at least the plan. So let's get to it. Here's the big question. Do nuclear weapons matter for international conflict? To get an answer to this initial answer anyway, to this question, we should go to the people who have to deal with this problem or these questions all the time, leaders of countries, right? So let's do some of that. So here we have former President Trump in a speech saying that North Korea is a menace to the world. Why is it a menace to the world? Because of its nuclear weapons. Right? That's what he's saying. And you may recall, some of you were paying attention to this, there was a period in which President Trump was tweeting kind of pretty alarming things at North Korea, including we're prepared to launch fire and fury on North Korea. This is in response to North Korea continuing to develop its nuclear and missile programs. Concern about nuclear weapons in the world is a bipartisan issue, right? I'm not trying to pick on President Trump. So here's President Obama saying that a nuclear armed Iran would raise the risk of nuclear terrorism. He's giving this speech back, this was in 2011, I believe, 2012. He's giving this speech in Israel, which feels very strongly about an Iranian nuclear weapon. And some of you may have seen the news yesterday that there appeared to be an explosion at an Iranian nuclear site that folks are linking to Israeli sabotage operation that is likely to delay Iran's nuclear development for 6 months or so, at least. And so this is Israel kind of stepping in because they are so concerned about an Iranian nuclear capability that they're willing to engage in this kind of sabotage to try to slow it down. And it's not just Iran and North Korea, although we talk about those countries quite a bit when it comes to nuclear proliferation. There's Russia too, right? So here's an article with a great headline: Russia unveiled a new arsenal of nuclear weapons. Should you be scared? Well, maybe a little. I don't know. One of the nuclear weapons they unveiled is a underwater nuclear drone, which is just a super cool thing. Like whatever you think about Russia's nuclear weapons, underwater nuclear drones are pretty cool. There's a debate, though. This isn't just a straightforward, yes, we should be panicked about nuclear weapons. And here is a point of view about North Korea that we shouldn't really be that worried about a North Korean nuclear weapon, that the same kind of deterrence logic that prevented us from the US from getting in a war with the Soviet Union during the Cold War will also apply to North Korea. That is, there is deterrence that can go on that will prevent the use of nuclear weapons in the world. And here are two of my colleagues at other admittedly lesser institutions, but very smart people. And they're arguing that a nuclear armed Iran wouldn't really be so dangerous because the actual history of countries using nuclear weapons to get stuff is actually pretty limited, right? We don't see a lot of that. You can just look back to US efforts to get what it wanted in wars in Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan. And did the nuclear weapons that we have really help us in that case? It's hard to see how they did. So there's an argument that maybe a nuclear armed Iran wouldn't be that big a deal after all. So back to the question, do nuclear weapons matter for international conflict? So some national leaders think they do. Some scholars aren't so sure. So my take, do they matter? I don't know, maybe. Sometimes. Honestly, I'm not sure. This is my somewhat unsatisfying answer to this question. We'll come back to this unsatisfying answer in a little bit. But in the meantime, I want to step back and talk to you about kind of a little question that's important for the big question, okay? What is the kind of context for the bigger question we're answering? And that is that there's a couple of competing theories of how security works, right? How does adding some new military capability, like an underwater nuclear drone, affect the security of your country, okay, if you're a national leader? And in order to kind of ask this question, I want to tell a story about my moving into a new house. So I moved to Williamsburg, I guess 5 or 6 years ago now, 2015, I think. And I was moving into a new house. And I was kind of getting ready to start the semester. I moved into the house It was August, so it was like the semester was just getting going. I'm moving my family, they're starting a new school, there's a lot going on. But before I get into this, I should say this is not my actual house. This is a stock photo of a similar house, right? I didn't want to use my real house here. I don't want to make this too personal. I have to give that disclaimer because sometimes if there's like parents watching to this video as well, they get kind of annoyed that their tuition money is going to buy faculty houses like this. So this is not, it's not quite the actual house, similar, but not the actual house. Anyway, so it's August, I'm moving in, I'm starting to teach a class. I got the kids going to new school. I got boxes everywhere. I'm a little preoccupied. That's the context for the story because I don't want to be the bad guy in this story. So I just want you to remember as we go through that I'm a little preoccupied at this time, okay? So I've been there maybe a week. I come home from work and I see on the door, taped to the door, this envelope, and it's like this beautiful stationery. I wish I had it around here somewhere. I should have like grabbed it so I could show you, but it's this beautiful stationery, and I open the envelope and there's this kind of beautiful calligraphy inside. And it turns out it's a note from my neighbor, Jeannie. Jeannie's a wonderful woman, older woman. Don't worry, she's okay. She's been vaccinated. Everything's fine. But she's a great person, and she wrote this note, and it basically said, "Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm so glad that you're my neighbor. My granddaughter is visiting me, and I wanted to let you know that the floodlight on the side of your house that's facing my house is on, and it's shining a light directly into her downstairs bedroom window, and it's making it hard for her to sleep. And normally I wouldn't say anything about it, but because my granddaughter is visiting, I wanted to let you know, and I was hoping that maybe you could shut off that light. Again, welcome to the neighborhood, Jeannie." Okay. And so I got this note. I'm like, oh, that's so nice. I have a nice neighbor. And so I went to look for the way to turn on. I didn't realize the floodlight was on. I felt kind of bad about that. And so I went to look for the switch for this floodlight, look around the house, and maybe I spent a few minutes. I was distracted. The kids were screaming. I had to get dinner ready. And so I kind of lost track and forgot about it. Never found the light switch. So a few days later, I come home from work and I stop by the mailbox, get the mail. And in the mail is a piece of paper that looks like it's kind of been haphazardly torn out of a notebook. And on it is kind of scrawled in thick black pen, "Turn off the light, Jeannie." So I'm like, oh, I really should turn that light off. So I go inside and I gather the kids and I'm like, let's find the light switch, kids. And we make a little thing of it. But I'm afraid that maybe they lost interest pretty quickly and I didn't really spend a lot of time on it. I ended up texting, I couldn't find the light switch. I ended up texting the real estate agent to ask the last owner where the light switch for this thing is, because I can't find it. Okay, so that's what I did. And I didn't hear back from the real estate agent. And then a few days later, I come home from work and I'm walking up the driveway and I see on the side of my house shattered glass everywhere and this giant rock, as if someone has thrown a rock and shattered my floodlight, the side of the house. Okay. Yeah. So this is, worrying, right? Like I moved to a new neighborhood and now I have a shattered floodlight and it looks like someone's intentionally damaging my home. And so I was a little concerned about this. So I went inside, made a few calls, and the next day I had some contractors come out and they built a little brick wall between Jeannie's property and my property. Tasteful brick wall, not like waist height, right? Like a tasteful brick wall. So I thought this was very nice, and it kind of helped delineate our property lines and kind of made clear, that that's your side and this is my side. Now, unfortunately, in the process of building the wall, the contractors had to cut down a few of Jeannie's prized crepe myrtles. Beautiful trees, very sad. I felt bad about that. And Jeannie apparently was pretty annoyed about that because the next day I happened to look out the window before I go to sleep and I see on her side of the wall, security patrols, walking around on her side of the wall with night vision goggles, the whole bit. Okay. And this freaked me out a little bit, right? Because now we got security people right on the other side of the wall. And so I immediately went on Amazon and I purchased one of these high-powered slingshot things, and I mounted it outside the bedroom window of my then 6-year-old Henry. My thinking was, so his window looked down on Jeannie's property, right? So my thinking was that if we get into a situation, Henry can get on that slingshot and make sure that the area is protected, because kids, even for a 6-year-old, he was pretty good with a slingshot. So anyway, things kind of escalated from there. And yeah, you don't need all the details. Although, oh, I will say, I finally heard like 3 weeks later, I hear back from the real estate agent, and it turns out the light switch was in the corner of the garage, inside the garage in the far corner, in the complete opposite side of the house of the floodlight. I don't know why would anyone put the light switch for the floodlight in the complete, anyway, that's not the point. And maybe I slightly exaggerated the details there, but the point is that this is an illustration of something called the spiral model, or also known as the security dilemma. And in the spiral model, things you do to defend yourself seem threatening to others. So I was building that tasteful wall to protect myself from Jeannie, but Jeannie saw it as aggressive because I cut down her trees, right? And then she gets security patrol to protect herself, but I see that as aggressive, so I get a high-powered slingshot for my 6-year-old, right? So the things you do to defend yourself in the spiral model seem threatening to others. And as a result, when you pursue your own security, you're actually making yourself less secure, okay? And we use this model to illustrate things like arms racing. So if I get this underwater nuclear drone, you got to get that underwater nuclear drone too to protect yourself. And so then the adversary has to get some new thing, a nuclear hypersonic missile, and then the other side needs to get that. And so you get this kind of spiraling sense of insecurity. Okay, so that's one model, the spiral model. In the spiral model, new capabilities like that underwater nuclear drone actually make you less secure. Okay. But there's a competing model. That competing model is the deterrence model. And in the deterrence model, new capabilities make you more secure, okay? So you get the underwater nuclear drone. I say, I'm not messing with you because you have an underwater nuclear drone, right? I don't want to mess with anyone who has an underwater nuclear drone. And that's the deterrence model. The fact that you have this show of strength means that I'm going to be more cautious and not mess with you, okay? So these are two competing models of the way security works in the world. And one of these models is probably wrong. Problem is, we don't know which one in any given situation, okay? But one of them is probably wrong. So that leads back to the question of nuclear weapons and how might nuclear weapons matter in international conflict. There are a few different ways that nuclear weapons might matter, okay? So one way that nuclear weapons might matter is they might actually make conflict less likely. It might actually create stability in the world through mutual assured destruction. And this is the idea that, and this was kind of the logic of US-Soviet nuclear competition during the Cold War. And the idea is that if the Soviet Union attacks the US with its nuclear weapons and destroys the US, annihilates the US can still send all of its nuclear weapons to annihilate the Soviet Union, and then everybody's annihilated, right? And that doesn't seem like a good idea. And so no one's going to attack in the first place because the consequences of attacking with nuclear weapons are so great, okay? This is the idea behind mutual assured destruction. So it could be that nuclear weapons actually create stability in the world. It could also be that nuclear weapons have no effect on conflict because nuclear threats just aren't credible. And it's easy to see this in the extreme situation, like let's say the US really wanted more beaches. And so they approached Aruba and they said to Aruba, we want your beaches. If you don't give us your beaches, we will nuke you, right? Aruba is not going to believe that. No one's going to believe that. That's not a credible nuclear threat, okay? So that's an extreme case. But even in a case of like you're already at war with some country, sometimes nuclear threats just aren't very credible. So think of the US experience in Afghanistan or Iraq. The threat of using nuclear weapons to resolve those conflicts, to get what we want in those conflicts, seems incredible somehow, right? That's not the kind of thing that really would make sense. And so nobody's going to take that threat seriously. But it could be that nuclear weapons only matter in the extreme, right? So that most nuclear threats aren't credible, but some are. And the ones that are the ones where you're facing an existential threat. Okay, so you're worried about an invasion or regime change, and then maybe nuclear weapons matter. So some people think like Israeli nuclear doctrine is focused on this idea that nuclear weapons are there to protect Israel from being eliminated as a country, right? Or we might worry about this with regard to North Korea. The US situation with North Korea gets a lot more complicated because of North Korean nuclear weapons. The idea is that if North Korea's leader was going to be unseated anyway, he might decide, well, I'm going to at least make the US pay a price for trying to unseat me, right, by using my nuclear weapons. So it could be that nuclear weapons matter in the extreme. There's also something called emboldenment that international relations scholars worry about a little bit. This is the idea that having nuclear weapons in your back pocket makes you behave a little bit differently, more aggressively in your foreign policy. And this is the main concern actually with regard to Iran. So if Iran were to develop nuclear weapons, the worry isn't so much that Iran would issue nuclear threats against Israel or the United States. The issue is more that Iran would behave with a more aggressive foreign policy, knowing that countries are less likely to want to mess with it because it has nuclear weapons now. Right? So this emboldenment is another way that nuclear weapons might matter. Nuclear weapons might make the world more dangerous by incentivizing a first strike or preventive conflict. And this is the idea that you might have to use your nuclear weapons first in order to use them at all. And so in the case of North Korea, you can imagine a situation where there's some crisis between the US and North Korea, and the US is massing a bunch of troops in the region, right, to kind of show strength and show commitment to our allies in the region. And North Korea misinterprets this or somehow thinks that the US is going to invade imminently or going to attack North Korea imminently. And if you're North Korea in that situation, it might actually make sense to use your nuclear weapons while you still can. Because if you wait around for the US to actually launch its preemptive strike, you might not have any nuclear weapons left to use. So maybe use them first to signal to the United States that you're serious, right? And because you fear that the United States would take out those weapons if you gave them enough time. So having nuclear weapons can sometimes create these perverse incentives for striking first, and that's very destabilizing. It's very worrisome when you're in that situation. And then finally, you don't have to actually intend to use nuclear weapons for them to kind of matter for international conflict. So it could be that mistakes happen. Someone misinterprets a false alarm, or there is an overreaction to some rhetoric from some country, and nuclear weapons are used either when they shouldn't be, or even accidentally because there's some kind of systems breakdown, or even mechanical breakdowns that could lead to an unintentional nuclear use. Or it could be that having nuclear material lying around is dangerous because it could be stolen by terrorists, for example, and that would be bad, right? So all of these are ways that nuclear weapons might matter in the world. Given all of this, it's a good thing that a bunch of scholars and analysts have looked at questions of this question of whether nuclear weapons matter for international conflict. So the best and brightest minds are on it, okay, I can assure you. And so I did a quick review of the literature in this area over the last 10, 15 years and what we think we know about nuclear weapons and conflict. So let me summarize that for you here. These are our findings. So we have some findings that say nuclear weapons make conflict less likely to occur, but we also have findings that show nukes have no effect on conflict onset, and that nuclear weapons make conflict more likely to occur. So, you know, that's not great. We have some findings that nuclear weapons make conflict less severe, but also that nuclear weapons make conflict more severe. We have findings that nuclear weapons make states more likely to win, and then we have some findings that nuclear weapons have no effect on winning. We have some work on nuclear superiority, which is like, do I have more nuclear weapons than you, right? And we might think that some scholars have found that nuclear superiority makes states more likely to win, and then some have found that nuclear superiority doesn't matter at all. So that's maybe not tremendously reassuring, right? So we have findings all over the map. We don't know the answer. So why is this so hard to figure out, right? Why is this such a tricky problem? What we really need to do to answer this question, how do nuclear weapons matter for international conflict, is an experiment, like a drug trial, like a vaccine trial. We're all kind of familiar with drug trials now because of COVID vaccines, right? So what we really need is an experiment. So what we want to do is we're going to make a list of all the countries in the world that don't have nuclear weapons. That's the easiest part of this thing. So we make a list of the countries and we divide them into two groups randomly. Half the countries we put in the control group and half the countries we put in the treatment group. And for all the countries in the control group, they don't get anything, okay? We leave them alone. The countries in the treatment group, we're going to give all of them, say, 5 nuclear weapons. Okay, we give them all 5 nuclear weapons, and then we watch them for 5 years, say, and we record how many times the countries that are in the treatment group get into conflict versus the number of times the countries in the control group get into conflict, okay? And then we see whether it's more. So if countries in the treatment group get into more conflicts than countries in the control group, then we might think, okay, nuclear weapons do have an effect. They make conflict more likely, okay? That's one thing we could do. So there are some practical considerations that make that a difficult experiment to run. So one is we have in universities, we have this thing called an institutional review board that does an ethics review of all the experiments you want to run. And this one might have there might be some ethical considerations associated with giving away nuclear weapons. Another problem is that I only have a few nuclear weapons and I would like to keep those for my own personal use. So I don't want to go giving them away. So we can't really run this experiment, right? So we need the next best thing. So here's another thing we could do. What if we just compare countries that have nuclear weapons to countries that don't have nuclear weapons? Just compare them straight up. If we find that countries with nukes get into more conflicts, then we can conclude that nuclear weapons lead to conflict. If we find that countries without nukes get into more, then we can conclude that nuclear weapons prevent conflict. Okay, so we can do this, right? This makes sense to you? Is this a good plan? We compare the countries. If we find the countries with nuclear weapons get into more conflicts, we can conclude that nuclear weapons lead to conflict, right? No, not really. Can anyone tell me, I know any kind of interaction is really tricky in these webinars, but let's try it. Go in the chat. Tell me why this isn't a good plan. What's wrong with my plan? While I have a sip of water, you go in the chat. Tell me what's wrong with this plan.
I feel like we should play the Jeopardy theme song.
That's right.
There's 30 seconds for people to type out their thoughts.
I should have that queued up. I'm sorry, Peter. I'm falling down on the job here. Okay, We're getting some answers in. Keep them coming, guys. What is wrong with my plan of just straight up comparing countries with nuclear weapons to countries without nuclear weapons? The countries that have nuclear weapons get into more conflict, then we can conclude that nuclear weapons lead to conflict. Awesome. These are great. Okay. So some great answers here. Keep them coming. So correlation is not causation. That's true. I agree. So the fact that these things kind of run together doesn't necessarily prove causation, sure, but it's suggestive, right? Like correlation isn't causation, but it's a decent way to bet. Let's see, we got a few others here. So are there confounding variables? So there sure are. So there are other things that might influence our the decision to go into conflict, right? And that will matter if they also influence the decision to get nuclear weapons. I'll talk more about that in a second. That's a great point. Let's see, going through these. So Mallory says, richer countries will have more nuclear weapons, and therefore will get into more conflicts naturally since they are stronger. Okay, so it could be that one of the things we'd be capturing here was really like the strength of the country rather than the effect of nuclear weapons. That's a great point. Thank you, Mallory. So since we're trying to avoid, Matthew says, since we're trying to avoid nuclear conflict, we shouldn't stand back and let it happen. I agree with that. Try to stop it. Countries that already have nukes are more likely to be more militarized anyway, thus being more aggressive anyway. That is a good answer. That Mary also says, countries that have nuclear weapons often have them because they are anticipating or are usually involved in conflict, right? So that is a great point. So there are a few, thank you for all of your comments. I appreciate it. Thank you for showing that a little participation in a mock lecture can work. Peter was skeptical. We've proven him wrong. So yes, so these are great points. So there are actually a few reasons, 4 reasons why this is a particularly hard thing to figure out, okay? And this issue of that a couple of you have raised now is sometimes called a selection effect, or if you want to seem cool at parties, you can call it endogeneity. That's what we call it in the social sciences. Maybe that only works if you go to the kind of parties that I go to, which I hope you don't. But this is the idea that like countries get nuclear weapons for particular reasons, okay? So let's say you're more likely to get a nuclear weapon because you feel threatened, because you see a war coming on down the line, because you have an adversary that is threatening to you, okay? And that's why you get a nuclear weapon. Well, in that case, the fact that you get into more wars later isn't necessarily because you got the nuclear weapons, it's because of that adversary that you were getting the nuclear weapons because of in the first place, okay? So there's a selection problem here. You've selected into nuclear weapons based on some other factor that also causes conflict. And when that happens, just looking at the difference in the number of conflicts between those two groups isn't going to tell us what we want to know, okay? Because of this confounding variable that a number of you are raising. Another issue that makes this a really hard question is we sometimes call a small n problem. This is the idea that we don't really have that many cases to work with. So there are not that many countries with nuclear weapons, thankfully, only 9 right now. And so those countries, they get into some conflicts, but not a lot of conflicts. And so we really don't have a lot to go on. Every individual data point that we have, every individual conflict that involves one of those countries' nuclear weapons, we're putting a lot of weight on it, right? Because we just don't have that much to go on. And so we might question whether we can really draw substantial conclusions from that small data set. We also might be lacking in some qualitative evidence about the causes of about how nuclear weapons lead to conflict. And that's because sometimes you don't talk about nuclear weapons explicitly, even though it's like very clearly in the backdrop of your thinking. So what I would really want to know, for example, here is like, I want like a recording of Iran's supreme leader, like banging on the table in a Security Council meeting saying, I would like to retaliate against Israel, but for this sabotage attack, but I won't because they got nuclear weapons, right? That's what we really want to see. That would be good qualitative evidence for telling us how nuclear weapons have this deterrent effect. The problem is that that's not something the Supreme Leader would ever say. Everybody knows Israel has nuclear weapons. He doesn't need to pound on the table and say that, right? That would be weird. So we don't really get that kind of qualitative evidence, but that doesn't mean that it's not actually a factor in how things are working in the world. Okay. And then the final piece that makes this hard to figure out is what we in the business call measurement validity. This is the idea that how you measure nuclear weapons kind of matters for the results you get. It's not enough to say, well, this country has nuclear weapons, this country doesn't, because when you say a country has nuclear weapons, what do you really mean? Because like North Korea's handful of nuclear weapons is not the same as the US's thousands of nuclear weapons, right? And so the way we measure nuclear weapons possession has a real impact on the results that we get. And that brings me to this picture, which is a Cold War era poster out of Hungary that looks at the US nuclear arsenal. So these are kind of drawings of US nuclear weapons with their specifications underneath. And mostly this slide is just an excuse to show you kind of a cool poster that I found. But it leads into some work that I've done in my own research that tries to get at this question of how do the makeup of your nuclear forces matter in international conflict? And the argument that we make in this work, this is with some colleagues at the University of California, San Diego, and the University of Nebraska. And the argument we make in this work is that nuclear forces are kind of like the Apple stock that your parents are currently selling in order to pay for your William and Mary education. That countries seek a diverse portfolio of nuclear weapons, just like families want a diverse portfolio of financial assets, stocks and bonds. So you're not putting all your eggs in one basket, right? So that you have some safety in that diversification. That helps defend against vulnerability to opposition forces, to technical problems, to accidents. Having a bunch of different kinds of nuclear weapons actually seems to matter in the world. So this is a quote from the former Secretary of the Air Force, Thomas Reed, the US Air Force, saying that nuclear diversity, the nuclear triad is having like missiles, submarine launched missiles, land-based missiles, and bombs dropped from aircraft. That's the triad, having a bunch of different kinds of weapons. So that triad diversity poses an insoluble targeting problem to any aggressor. Any attack that might seriously cripple one leg of the triad, like land-based missiles or aircraft, constitutes a clear and unambiguous warning to the other two. So there's no known way to attack all three simultaneously. And this logic is behind the idea that countries want to have diversity in their nuclear forces. And that ends up being what they do, okay? So this chart shows on the horizontal axis here, over time, how many years you've had nuclear weapons. It shows that you get a more diverse portfolio as you go. So when you start off with nuclear weapons, you have a lot of aircraft up here and not very many missiles down here. But as you go, you gain more and more missiles and fewer aircraft as your portfolio of nuclear weapons becomes more and more diverse, okay? And in the end, we find that that leads to deterrence. states that have more diverse nuclear force structures are less likely to be targeted by other nuclear states. The bottom line here is that there are lots of dimensions to nuclear forces, and this ends up being a measurement problem. So when you talk about, well, North Korea has nuclear weapons and so does the United States, that conflates two very different things. The US nuclear arsenal is way different than North Korea's nuclear arsenal, and that matters for whether states get deterrence out of their nuclear weapons, okay? So studies or policies or public debates that look at just one of those dimensions, like do they have it or not, or how many do they have, but not how strong they are, or not how far they can go, that risks reaching the wrong conclusion. So let me circle back to the unsatisfying answer to the big question that I asked at the beginning of the talk. Do nuclear weapons matter for international conflict? And my answer stands. I don't know, maybe sometimes, honestly, I'm not sure. And this is a little bit unsatisfying, okay? So when you're in high school and when you start out in your college classes, the questions that your professors ask you have answers, right? Like even in your really difficult math class in AP Calc, right? The questions have answers that you're answering, okay? And then when you start to get into intermediate level college courses, the kind of landscape changes a little bit, and the questions that you're being asked don't have answers anymore. And this can be pretty frustrating, both for students and for parents. So parents are sometimes thinking at this point, like, wait, I'm paying a lot of money, or a lot of money is being paid for my kid to go to this university, and they've got some professor up at the front of the room or in some fake room asking questions, and they don't even know the answer. What are we paying for this? And students are sometimes frustrated by this too, because they want to know the answer to put on an exam or in an essay, right? This is really a transformation from the kind of learning that you do in high school to the kind of learning that you want to be doing in college and beyond, right? And you shift from answering the question, what is the answer? You shift from asking what is the answer to asking what is the plan for getting the answer? What is the research design that's going to generate new knowledge in this world, right? This is what I want to see. This is a transition that I get to witness here at William and Mary. The questions that have already been answered are boring, right? We don't want to spend any time on those. What we want to do is spend time on the frontier of knowledge, right? Spend time in the area where we don't know the answers to the questions that you're asking. That's the exciting stuff. That's the kind of thing that we want to be doing here at William and Mary. And overseeing that transition from asking the kind of questions that have answers to asking the questions that don't is like the most fulfilling part of my experience as a professor. It's why I'm here. It's why I'm at William and Mary. So if this sounds interesting to you, if this sounds like something that you would be willing to engage in, to be kind of on the frontier of knowledge, then you should join me. And we'll try to answer these unanswered questions together. And with that, I'm happy to answer your answerable questions about nuclear weapons, getting along with your neighbors. You can also ask me about government, international relations, public policy, doing research with faculty at William & Mary. That's a big part of what we do is undergraduate research. And if you have questions about why the other schools you're considering are inferior to William & Mary, then I'd be happy to answer those. If you don't want to ask them in the chat now, then you can ask me by email at jkaplow@wm.edu. But please, let's prove Peter wrong again and post some questions to the chat so we can keep the conversation going.
Also, before we get into the questions, I do want to reiterate that we have department chats this Saturday as well. So if you want to jump into a Zoom meeting with the department heads or faculty representatives for government, international relations, public policy, economics, those are all happening on Saturday between the hours of like 12 and 4. So yeah. It looks like you have one. And the question is, how is your current relationship with your neighbor?
Great. Yeah. So all was forgotten. We tore the wall down. Everything is fine. Yeah, Jeannie and I get along okay. Although she was one of these people who kind of in the midst of COVID, like she would try to wear the mask, but it would slip down, and she likes to get like really up close. So she freaked me out a little bit for a while there, but now she's safely vaccinated, and we're all doing just fine here on our street in idyllic Williamsburg, Virginia.
And then the follow-up, does your son still have the slingshot?
We had to remove the slingshot because here's a parenting tip in case there are any parents watching. Don't give your 6-year-old a high-powered slingshot mounted to their window. Just it's not. We would wake up like in the middle of the night and we hear like these weird kind of crashing sound, and the kid would be just like firing away from that thing. So we had to take it down.
Seems fair. Also, with Camp Perry nearby, seems impressive that you were able to make that fly.
Yeah, I had to skirt some rules there, Peter.
Cora's asking, what are your opinions on the efficacy of Iran's nuclear deal?
That's a good question. So I am a supporter of the Iran nuclear deal. So my background is in intelligence work. And so one of the things I really liked about the Iran nuclear deal is that it gave the US and its allies really, really good access into what Iran was doing, with the idea that if Iran decided to pursue nuclear weapons, there would be significant advance warning because of our presence in the deal. And so the big criticisms of the Iran deal were around, well, it's going to expire and then Iran will be free to do whatever they want. It doesn't cover some of this other stuff on missiles and other bad things that Iran does. And all that is true. But for me, I'd rather have access to the program for that period of time, kick the can down the road a bit, and in the meantime, have like the ability to know what was going on in Iran. So I was actually a big proponent of the deal, and I was shocked that the US was able to get such a good deal out of Iran. In fact, I remember calling up a couple of my friends who were working on the negotiating team and like just saying, I'm blown away. I can't believe you guys managed to pull this off. Yeah, so I'm a supporter. I think what's going on now with Israel is partly an attempt to keep the US out of the deal. We'll see how effective that strategy is by Israel to try to sabotage the talks. So it'll be interesting to watch that play out.
Cool. Joel is asking, is this sort of a really chill format typical of William and Mary lectures?
So no, because I don't usually lecture. So here's the thing, like I don't give, like when they ask me to do a mock lecture, like the mock part is the real thing here, because I don't lecture, I discuss, right? So like the classes are really interactive. I think there are very few William and Mary professors who are like lecturing. Mostly we're talking to you and trying to have a conversation. So the brilliant substance and delivery is real, but usually there's more interaction, right? It's usually not me talking at you the way this has been.
As someone who's graduated in the past couple of years from William and Mary, I would say yes, this is pretty standard in terms of overall lectures. Emma is wondering, what are some classes that potential IR majors should take, in parentheses, beyond your own classes though?
Right, so you should definitely take my classes, but beyond that, so the IR program is really cool because it brings in elements of a bunch of different disciplines, like academic disciplines. So there's a fair amount of political science in the government department. There's economics, there's history, there's sociology. And one of the great things that the IR major allows you to do is you're forced to get a taste of each of those disciplines. And then students kind of realize, well, this discipline is more appealing to me than this other one, right? And that'll kind of guide where you go next. There's a kind of required IR course that brings together all these kind of different perspectives on international relations, and that's a good course to take. But really, it kind of depends on where your interests lie, because IR is such a broad field that there's so much you could do. You could be working on international trade. You could be working on more sociological things. You could be working on global history. You could be working on nuclear weapons. So it's really very broad, and it allows you a lot of freedom to kind of choose your own path through the major.
So that's a great segue into Connor's question, which is, how do you build a career in IR or international security intelligence work and progress upward, given that career path is not straightforward like those available to STEM people?
Yeah, that is a good question. So it's maybe more of a question than I can adequately answer here. But I spend a lot of time talking to students about career paths in international security. And we do a lot of that here. So I usually will give like every year or two, I'll give like a big seminar on how to how to get a job doing international security. Because it is a little bit off the beaten path, I guess. Like if you're going into consulting or financial services, or you're going to med school or law school, there's kind of a prescribed pathway. But in international relations, it's a little different. You can kind of go in a bunch of different directions. And it really all amounts to building up a body of knowledge or expertise that sets you apart. And one of the ways that William & Mary helps you do that is by giving you the chance to do independent research as an undergraduate. This is something that employers and international relations really value. This idea that you went off and you did this thing. You had guidance from faculty, right? But you went off and you did this independent research project and you came to some useful conclusion. And that's something that William & Mary gives you the opportunity to demonstrate in ways that not every place does. And so I often will recommend to students that you kind of seek out those research opportunities fairly early on in your William & Mary experience, because that stuff can be really valuable in helping you get internships and ultimately jobs.
Great. Back to hearing more about your thoughts. Someone is asking, what are your thoughts on the U.S. adopting a no first use policy?
So the problem for the U.S. in adopting the no first use policy is that there are specific situations in which the U.S. Wants to reserve the right to use nuclear weapons because we think we need the nuclear weapons for deterrence. Now this goes back to like, are nuclear weapons useful? Now, if you think that they aren't useful, then there's no problem going with a no first use policy. And this is just an idea that we would pledge not to be the first ones to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. So the debate about this is that there are certain situations where and this was particularly true during the Cold War, where if the Soviet Union started rolling tanks through Germany, the US has no conventional way to defeat that. And so in order to prevent the Soviet Union from actually rolling those tanks, the US needs to be able to credibly threaten to use nuclear weapons in response to their conventional forces. And that's kind of the logic behind not having a no first use policy. My deep down feeling that I'm willing to admit to you all here today, because this is a safe space, is that it doesn't matter. Is that it doesn't matter what we say, whether we say no first use or we say, what some other doctrine, that nobody really cares what our stated policy is toward these things. And that saying we have a no first use policy wouldn't necessarily buy us the international credibility that some advocates say it would. And not saying it doesn't really buy us much in terms of deterrence, because we can always bail on our policy when the chips are down, right? Like no one's going to hold us accountable if we decide, actually, no first use, we were just kidding, we're going to use them. So I don't really think it matters that much what we do.
Wow, we just got a hot take, everyone.
Yeah, hot take.
So then Matthew's wondering, what are your opinions on Japan's impending release of nuclear waste into the ocean? Sounds bad.
That does sound bad. Matthew, I don't know about that. That is news to me. So I will just go on the record right now saying I am against the release of nuclear waste into the ocean. I don't know any of the details of this, but it sounds bad. I'm against it. Thumbs down.
Matthew, feel free to cite your sources in the chat, please. Okay, Adam's asking, why do nations who officially deny / obscure their nuclear stockpiles, i.e. Israel or North Korea, gain from this? And should this be treated as a diplomatic problem or a failure to control nuclear material supply?
This is a great question. So this is actually the subject of a research project that is happening now in Nuke Lab, my undergraduate research lab. So 2 students in my lab are currently doing research into nuclear transparency and what drives states to maintain or give up various kinds of nuclear ambiguity or nuclear transparency. So there's kind of 2 things going on here in this question. So in one case, there's Israel, which does not officially acknowledge its nuclear weapons, even though everybody knows they have nuclear weapons. And the real reason for this is diplomatic. So this kind of dates back to the late 60s, early 70s, when Israel first developed nuclear weapons and basically reached an agreement with the United States that, in not so many words, that the Israel wouldn't be the first to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East, right? And what that means is they're not going to test them publicly. They're not going to make a big deal out of it. And maybe that gives other countries in the region, like Egypt, which had nuclear ambitions at one point, an excuse not to develop nuclear weapons. Whereas if Israel had really decided we're just going to go all in on the nukes and talk about them a lot, that may have driven Egypt to also seek weapons, and then other countries and so on. And so it was really a way to kind of keep a diplomatic lid on further proliferation in the region. The North Korea situation is a little different, where North Korea doesn't want to say exactly how many nuclear weapons they have and how good they are, because if they did, they feel they would make their nuclear weapons more vulnerable to attack. China does the same thing. So China doesn't want to say we have this many nuclear weapons, because if they do, and we got in a war with China, the US got in a war with China, and then we took out that many nuclear weapons, then we'd know that we were good to go, right? That we had done okay. And what China wants is for there to be enough uncertainty in US leaders' minds that they didn't quite get all the nuclear weapons, that they're going to avoid going into some conflict in the first place. So that ambiguity actually might create stability or safety, because the US might hesitate to engage in a conflict because it's worried that it doesn't know whether it's going to be able to get all the nuclear weapons.
Awesome. So someone's asking, because you brought this up, what are some examples of IR majors independent research projects?
Oh, lots of examples. So just thinking of students I've recently supervised. So we have an honors thesis program at William & Mary where you can get honors in your major by writing a senior thesis. And I've had students who are interested in nuclear weapons usually come to work with me. So I have a lot of nuclear weapons projects. So I had a student that recently worked on whether the length of time you had nuclear weapons led to international stability. So like if you're a beginner with nuclear weapons, are things like more dangerous for you? But then as you gain nuclear maturity, you gain experience with your nuclear weapons, things kind of settle out and you get into less conflict. That was a really interesting project. Another student do some work on small arms in Africa. This is the kind of flood of like guns used in kind of by rebel groups in Africa, and how that affects kind of local violence. And that was a really interesting project as well. Those are the kind of projects that people ask me to supervise. But there are plenty of other different kinds of projects focused more on other aspects of international relations that are being done. And in fact, I think if you go on like the IR website, they have some examples of student projects, or at least somewhere on William & Mary's website, there are some examples you can look for.
Gotcha. So just as a heads up, we have just a few more minutes, everyone, so we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can, but want to be mindful of everyone's time. So one question is about the Nuke Lab. So does Nuke Lab do work with nuclear energy and research into cost benefit on use, especially as the United States moves away from fossil fuels?
So we don't have any, we have no projects on that currently, but the way the lab is structured, you come into the lab, you work on an existing project, and then you branch off and do your own thing. So the idea is to help you kind of get integrated into the research group. And then once you've done that for a semester, usually, then you start to have ideas about other things you want to research. And then some new student is going to come in and help you with your research project. And so I would love to have some work on nuclear energy in Nuke Lab. I don't currently, but I would like to do that. So come join us and do it here.
And Mary is wondering, what do you see as major components and threats to international security outside of nuclear weapons?
So in my other work, I'm focused a lot on cyber as a big issue. We've seen a real uptick in cyber kind of provocations and threats and escalation. And getting a lid on this is really tricky. The big problem with cyber is like nobody really knows how far you can push on a cyber conflict before like people start getting angry in the real world and like bombing you back, right? Like, and so there's this question of what does escalation look like in cyberspace is one that I also think is like a big issue and something we're going to be spending a lot of time thinking about.
Great. Elise is asking you to reflect on your career with the State Department, and what aspect of it did you find most interesting and enjoyable? And do you have any particular stories with regards to that?
So I spent most of my career in intelligence, only a little bit of my career at the State Department, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. There is a great feeling that comes from representing your country as a diplomat, even when you're not like doing anything particularly important. So I remember like attending some international conferences like the US delegate, right? And it's just it's great. Like you go around and when you talk, like people are paying attention, right? Like you feel like you are doing something for your country, representing your country. And that feeling of mission actually is something that I think is prevalent in the whole national security establishment, not just the State Department, and is one reason that people who get into that line of work really love it, because you're going to work and you're like, feel like you're doing something good with your job, right? And not everybody feels like that in their day-to-day job. So yeah, I have stories, but I probably can't get into them right now.
Great. And then last question, I'm just going to pose this one though. What would you say if you could describe William and Mary or William and Mary students in 3 words? What would they be?
Oh man, you should have laid the groundwork for this one, Peter, earlier. Three words. I'll give you 1 word. William and Mary students are engaged, right? This is like the key thing about William and Mary students for me. So we have just been through a tough year. You guys are aware of this, right? There's this whole pandemic happening, and we switched from in-person classes, just like you probably did, to remote classes. I was remote asynchronous in the fall. I'm remote synchronous now. It has been difficult for everyone, and through it out, I kept saying to myself, oh, thank God I'm in William and Mary and I have William and Mary students, because every step of the way, like, the students have been there working with me, engaged, and just, with this understanding that we're all kind of getting through this together, and their good humor and understanding as I kind of attempted to learn this whole new, like, slides over the shoulder thing, and like, how do I talk in Zoom? Everyone has been willing to stick with it, right? And I think that is something that we wouldn't have seen at every college. And it's my William and Mary students who are engaged with the material, engaged with the effort, engaged with the work, that makes me happy to be a professor here.
Great. That's a great answer. All right, everyone. That's all the time we have tonight. Professor will be giving this lecture again on Wednesday. So if you want to come and listen again, you are more than welcome. I encourage you to reach out to him. His email is right there on the screen, so feel free to reach out with him. If you have any questions, admissions related, feel free to contact me as well. And with that, thank you again for joining. We appreciate the participation. This has probably been one of the best mock lectures I've watched thus far. So thank you, Professor Kaplow, and have a good night. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.